Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to do something a little bit new with my channel. I'm trying to experiment a little bit with the kinds of videos that I do. Some people have suggested that I be more positive with my videos. Now, I honestly don't see myself as being negative in any way. I just like to tear things down in order to build them back up the correct way, tearing down the lie in order to find the truth. But anyways, if you find me negative, I'll try and be more positive. Or at the very least, I'm going to try to be a little bit neutral. I'm going to talk about creation and go through my own way of creating a story, specifically in what I am doing right now, which is within graphic novels and comics. First off, I am not an expert in this. I am learning like everybody else, but I am hopefully doing so with some speed and looking at all the greats and how they put things together in order to figure out how this works. Because part of the reason why the comic industry was destroyed over the last 10 to 15 years was because they specifically wanted to and stated that they wanted to change the way that comics were made and really break with that history and only move forward in this new way. Whereas I'm looking at those old books, I'm looking at interviews and the way that people said that they made comics, and I'm saying this is how you should do it. So I'm going to talk specifically about panel layout for a little while here, but I'll get into that in a few minutes. For this, and if I do more videos like this, it's all going to be centered around pattern recognition. Now, first of all, the reason why, partly again, I'm doing this video is because my week has been turned upside down just a little bit. I don't get the time right now to think about the things that I usually think about in order to make a video, in order to do a video. Why? Because I'm helping out a friend. I'm doing some legal research for him for free because that's what I used to do. And the thing about legal research is that, well, first of all, it's not giving me any time except to do that. And the legal research that I do is normally based on two different, very almost contradictory things. You take human motivations and legal documents, and then you put them both together and they give them to you and say, figure these things out. It's kind of like a puzzle. I think that actually is very, very helpful for me thinking about how to make a story, because that's kind of what a story is. You take the human and then you take things that are very strictly put together and you throw them together to figure out how this puzzle fits. So, being in that mindset, I've been thinking about these things for the last little while in the back of my head, how you actually look at these patterns. And secondly, and I gotta throw this in there, although it may seem weird, I listened to this video by Perch over at Comics by Perch, and he was talking about Comicsgate, and he was basically indicating that they're making people feel uncomfortable by trying to bring them into their group. They should be concentrating on things like the sales numbers instead of I don't like this if they want to actually help comics. And I thought to myself, okay, you don't know what you're talking about. First of all, most of us used to do sales numbers videos all the time when that information was available. I know I did one almost every month. People like Eglantine used to do them all the time, poring over them. I know Wes still does them. But anyways, he's talking about how you look at sales numbers, not just at what people like. And I'm thinking to myself, well, first of all, I don't think you can divorce what the sales numbers tell you with what the audience is telling you that they like and they don't like. Number two, you're also assuming that what people like is inherently irrational and subjective, whereas it can be subjective in itself, but based upon objective things that exist. And that's the whole point. There is an objective standard whereby I cannot like something. And Perch simply can't see that. He uses arguments that seem very rational, but they concentrate on one part of rationality to the exclusion of others, and then they become irrational. He thinks that it is irrational completely to go upon what you like and what you don't like. I'm saying, well, yes, first of all, if you're not being rational, that is irrational, but at the same time, you can actually look at patterns that either would be part of what is beautiful, which I take to be an objective thing, or at the same time, what is instinctual within human beings, or both, and say, while you're expressing this in a way that you cannot understand, even understand rationally, that's not to say there isn't a rational reason why you don't like this thing. I would say the other side, the quote unquote progressive people, base their I don't like things upon lies. That's why it's irrational both within their expression and within the origin of what they're trying to say. Whereas we on this side, and especially people in Comicsgate who are concentrating on merit, are looking at it and saying, instinctually, I don't like this, but there is a reason for it. And I go over these reasons all the time within my videos because it's not appealing to the male eye, because there's parts of the brain or parts of your body which, again, like your eye structure, which tells you this isn't correct. Whether it's something instinctual that says there isn't a fixed pattern here, therefore your mind says instinctually, no fixed pattern, back away from this thing because, again, being a caveman, that would say, you don't know what's going on here, danger, danger, therefore you don't like it. All these kinds of things. There is a reason why you don't like it, and although you cannot express it rationally, it can be expressed rationally. And he's just not getting that. And that big old spiel leads into my talk about comic panels, because this is something that is according to a pattern which is either appealing to the human eye or not. And there are several subsections to this that can be either appealing to a human being or specifically appealing to a male or a female, and simply are not. And I think that's what a lot of people are missing right now. They're not looking for the pattern within the old great ways of telling stories and appealing to those things that actually worked, because that would lead more and more to sales. So, again, I'm just going to tell you about my process in bringing these things about concerning, this time, panel layout. Now, you're looking at some of the panels and some of the art from my graphic novels in the background and my graphic novel campaigns. The links for all of those campaigns, the first book, which is Thomas Valiant, and the second book, which is The Valiant Heroes, those still can be found and purchased at the Indiegogo site, the link in the description for this video, and also my upcoming graphic novel, which is CROM the Destroyer, which is an homage to Conan tales and Conan stories, and that's a bit what I'm going to get into with the panel layout for the difference between superhero and fantasy comics. Again, the links for all those are in the description if you want to go and order or pre-order or sign up for my graphic novels. And you're looking at art for those graphic novels in the background to try to give you some visual cues, although I'm not going to sync the entire thing up together with what I'm talking about. And I'll move on to some other panels from different artists in order to show you exactly what I'm talking about. Now, when I began writing the script for my first graphic novel, which was Thomas Valiant, I had with me Renzo Rodriguez as an artist. Now, I am blessed to have Renzo with me. He contacted me and wanted to be a part of my project, and I said, yes, you have the exact qualities that I'm looking for, which is a very clean superhero art style. But the thing about Renzo is that he's kind of spoiled me, because I was putting down in the script, and by the way, that script was available with the first campaign. I think I might still have a couple left. I'm not entirely sure. I could reprint them if people want me to for some future campaign. But anyways, my script I put down in a very strict way. Why? Because I wanted to be the storyteller, because I'm the writer and I'm very much a visual person. So I'm writing visual storytelling so that Renzo can follow it within even the panel development within the book. However, it's about half and half. I had strict ways of laying down the panels in a lot of the pages, about half, and about half I said to Renzo, go to town. Show me what you can do. And Renzo was extremely creative and extremely well-versed in putting down panels on a page. And because I knew I was going to learn as I went along, I didn't get too far ahead of Renzo with my script, because the book is, I think, 84 pages, maybe longer. So I was barely into about 20 pages when we started the script and putting it down as actual panels on a page. And then I got to see what Renzo could do with panel development as compared to my own, and we sort of mixed that together for the rest of the book. But it's very much a superhero way of looking at panels. Now, if you're looking at a normal North American comic, you can have panels, usually I've seen between 1 to about 12 panels per page. Now, 12 is really pushing it, and I would say you would probably have to be the artist in order to want to have 12 panels. That is a lot. Usually the maximum is about 9. If you're thinking of a 9-panel grid, something like the old Keith Giffen Baxter paper Legion of Superheroes. That was a 9-panel page. I would say that's pretty much your maximum, again, unless you're doing something very specific. Oh, by the way, if you're wondering, for manga, it's about typically 0 to 6 panels per page with a average of 4 panels per page. But anyway, we're going back to North American comics. That's all I'm concerned with here. So typical for North American comics would be about 6 to 9 panels per page. People in North America like to push the envelope. Now, the thing is that when I actually started my second book, right now, the second book, which is The Valiant Heroes, the campaign for it is up and you can go order it right now. But that was not the second book I started into creating. The second book I started into creating was CROM the Destroyer. And for my artist for that book, I have Jim O'Reilly, who is a spectacular artist. But I made the mistake of thinking that Jim was Renzo and that my panel layout would work the same way for Jim as it did with Renzo. That was a mistake. First off, if you have a artist that is forwarding you their portfolio in order for you to pour through it, pay very much attention to panel layout in order for you to think whether or not you're going to mesh with this person as an artist if you're just a storyteller. But anyway, the thing with the panel layout for Jim O'Reilly, as opposed to Renzo Rodriguez, is the fact that Jim was doing for me what is basically a fantasy novel, whereas Renzo was doing a superhero story. And those two things are not exactly the same. And although Jim is a very clean artist with clean line work, which is just like Renzo, but in a different way. And by the way, this is the kind of artist that I am attracted to because I like clean art. That's where my books are going, with clean art, distinct art. But anyways, Jim puts a lot more detail into things than Renzo does, which I think serves well the more fantasy aspect, whereas you're going with something more iconic with the superhero. And this does play into how many panels you can put down on a page. So I'll have to apologize to Jim right here and now, saying that, yes, I didn't consider wholly his art style well enough before I started writing the script for the panels. So Jim is a little bit hard pressed to put all the panels down on each page that I was trying to give him for the first chapter of my book, which he is working on and has spectacular art for, some of which you're probably looking at in the background. But the thing is, for me, since I'm a comic producer, I can add a few pages if I really want to. What my typical book looks like is that it's separated into chapters, making up about 60 some to 80 some pages in my graphic novels. Why? Because I want to be able to break them down into chapters 1, 2, and 3, or 1, 2, 3, and 4, in order to perhaps sometime in the future publish these as floppy comics, which will be somewhere between 20 and 26 pages. At the very least, that option is open to me. Anyways, this is why I put down the stories in the way that I do. And besides that, there's also a beginning, middle, end storyteller in me, and I follow that pattern. Even though you might have 4 chapters, one would be an extra story at the end, or some kind of side story, or an epilogue, things like that. Anyways, so I'm basing everything I do upon old floppy comics and how they worked. And again, at this point, I'm not averse in any way, shape, or form to adding extra pages to a chapter if my artist needs a couple extra pages. Now, if I was working for a comic company, I couldn't do this, and I would need to be more strict within what I can do. So, back to panel development. When I originally was creating the script for Thomas Valiant and working with Renzo, what I was doing was to look at what kind of story I wanted to tell. And I knew that I wanted to tell an X-Men kind of story, and I would say the great X-Men kind of story, which you got with John Byrne and Chris Claremont. That was my basic pattern of the storytelling. There was a little bit of JLA mixed in there, but at the same time, I'm looking almost specifically at that great run of comics. So I went back to my long boxes and I pulled out those X-Men and I started looking through the panel development, which John Byrne used in order to tell the Chris Claremont stories. And I based the original way that I was looking at panel development on those books and how they actually worked. And there was a free flow to John Byrne's style and his panel development. But at the same time, when I moved over to writing CROM the Destroyer, I didn't initially do that, and I should have. I am trying to build a book that looks very much like your Roy Thomas, John Buscema, or John Buscemi, depends on how you say it, run of Conan the Barbarian in Marvel, which lasted for years and years and years. And it's because I'm publishing in a comic format, so I didn't look at things like Savage Sword of Conan, which has different panel style. Why? Because it's a larger magazine rather than a comic book, and so there's different panel development there, even though we have Roy Thomas and John Buscema doing their work together again over and over again in that magazine. Oh, by the way, just in case you're wondering, I'm going to try to do this for CROM the Destroyer. I'm going to offer the main book as a normal graphic novel, which is comic sized, and then I'm going to try to get CROM the Destroyer with the black and white version as if it was a Savage Sword of Conan and publish it in that magazine format so that you can see more detail in Jim's beautiful art. But anyways, here's one of the things that I think I have pulled out of the pattern of panel development that is different for fantasy stories as compared to superhero stories, and which I did not initially put into my thinking in writing the first chapter for CROM the Destroyer. Oh, by the way, the second chapter for CROM the Destroyer is being penciled by Nick Axe. He is the beautiful artist which did those two great pinups for the Thomas Valiant campaign. I'll put those up in the background. And he did the cover for CROM the Destroyer already, which I'll put that up in the background. And in case you're wondering, yes, you have seen Jim O'Reilly's work within my work already because he did the cards for Thomas Valiant. I think I met him through Don Chin. And we're going to keep the stylized format of how the story is told with these two different artists. I think Jim is going to be doing the third chapter as well because we have Mike Gustovich doing the inking for all of these pencils. He's an old Marvel and DC hand who actually worked on Conan. I think it was Conan the King that he worked on, and also moved into his own books like Justice Machine, etc. But the thing is that, again, going back to panels, I'm trying to get back and stay on track here. With panels for a superhero book, if you're looking at superheroes, you're looking at something which I think is much more intimate, as it were. You can get up close and personal with how you're going to portray your characters on a page and therefore use larger panels, and that works well within creating a superhero comic. But if you're doing fantasy, and really here's something that I think most fantasy comic writers just don't get, or fantasy comic artists just don't get today, I think that the pulled back way of looking at your story is much more in tune with your fantasy novel way of looking at a comic story. It gives you a pulled back, almost a theatrical or TV way of viewing this story, which is impersonal to some extent, and it lends itself better to the story. Now, what am I talking about? Why does this have anything to do with panel development? Well, if you're going with a standard panel number, which I think John Buscema did do, and variations upon one theme, it's because it is something that is putting a lot of panels down on a page for various reasons. I think the number one reason that is sticking out, at the very least in my mind, is that you're looking at something which is much more theatrical rather than something which is much more personal within your comic book, which has larger panels, closer views of what is going on, all this kind of thing. So again, what am I talking about? Well, this is comparing something like John Byrne's run on the X-Men, which it didn't seem to. Now, I could be wrong about this. I'll probably have to go back and look at this to find some kind of pattern there again, but it seemed like he was very much free flow with his panel development. Whereas you have other artists, which I would say, again, the quintessential person to look at for this would be Keith Giffen with his 9-panel layout. There was something I noticed even back then when I was reading that run of Legion of Superheroes. There was a book that got interspersed with the rest, possibly because Keith Giffen wasn't able to keep up at that time. It was a filler issue and it had a different artist, and I really didn't like the artist that much, but it was his panel layout which drove me insane. Why? Because I'm used to the Keith Giffen 9-panel layout. And I know a lot of people really hate that version of actually static 9 panels every page, all exactly the same size. I actually really like that. I'm probably never going to do anything like that, but I loved his way of telling stories. And it was, again, a more theatrical way of looking at the story. Why? Because if you're going to have 9 panels per page, those are small panels on every page, all of the same size. So the way that you're going to do a shot, the way that you're going to look at the action, while it doesn't have to be pulled back back all the time, it does lend itself to a pulled back way of looking at the shot that you're going to be putting in that panel. A lot of what you're going to get is a fairly standard, I wouldn't say the same all the time, but fairly standard way of looking at a pullback or a very pulled back shot of what you're going to have within your panel. And again, that leads itself to a theatrical image within the mind of your reader, as far as I'm concerned. Now, let's move back to John Buscema and his run on Conan with Roy Thomas. What I did in order to revamp my second chapter, in order to give it to Nick X, which I'm just struggling with the last few pages in order to do that right now. I wanted to revamp the entire thing in order to actually put this panel development into this more Conan the Barbarian mold. And by the way, Jim, if you're listening, yes, chapter 3 will look like that as well. So I'll give you a little bit of a break, not my crazy panel layout, which actually comes at the first. Although it's fairly standard, it basically looks like what Thomas Valiant looked like. So again, John Buscema. I would say that John Buscema and Roy Thomas actually started out in a way that they were playing around with the panel development. So what I decided to do was to look at basically the middle of the giant run of John Buscema on Conan the Barbarian. And if you look there, you can see that John Buscema is using a very specific pattern. And these two men, by the way, if you listen to the interviews with them, which I do and I should do more of, and I would love to have Roy Thomas on my show. But anyways, if you listen to what they have to say about Conan the Barbarian, they did it in a very specific way that was different, and they knew was different from what you were going to get within the superhero comics from Marvel. One of the very specific things, which I didn't realize at the first, but now I realized it about, 15 pages in when I was writing my script, is that Roy Thomas said, you see, if you look at the Conan the Barbarian that we did, you'll never see any of these Marvel sound effects anywhere. And I went, yeah, I never noticed that. It does seem to have a quiet rolling out of the story. It is very much of that kind of, again, quiet theatrical movement which you would get within Conan the Barbarian. Now, when he says there's no sound effects, that's not entirely true. There's no sound effects like bap, pow, wham that you're going to get within your normal Marvel comics. There are sound effects as in screams that would go all the way over a page or things like that. So something you would normally get in a word balloon that is stretched out over a larger space. Now, I myself was playing with this within the first chapter, within things like bow shots and stuff like that. But anyways, again, going back to that middle of the run for John Buscema on Conan the Barbarian, you will see, and I can't remember the number of the book right off the top of my head, but I'll stick it in the visuals in the background so you can see what I'm talking about, where you can see John Buscema step back and go, okay, I'm going to start with a standard panel development for every page here, except for the first one, which should be a splash page. And then we'll do variations on that theme. And his standard is a 6-panel page. And what kind of a 6-panel page? Well, it's divided very specifically into top, middle, bottom. And I would say, again, this goes back to almost an instinctual or perhaps even a transcendent way of human thinking, which takes things and separates them into threes, into trinities, into beginning, middle, end, into your 3-step primary logical argument, etc., etc. But that's an entire separate video. But anyways, what he did was you had top, middle, bottom, and each of those were exactly the same in size. And of those, he put 2 panels in each. And it started off as large panel, small panel, small panel, large panel, small panel, or the exact opposite in order to keep it fresh, which would be, again, small panel, large panel, small panel, large panel. It's very specific and it's very much exactly the same on every page, and then he starts to play with it. And again, I would say this is very much a theatrical way of looking at the story. Why? Because if you're looking at those large panels, they look like a movie screen. If you look at those small panels, they look like an old style, at the very least, television screen. What you would get from the beginning of television up until you started getting these monstrosities of giant televisions. So from this basic 6-panel pattern, he would then look at, okay, how much story do I have to put on a page? And can I separate some of these panels into smaller panels? Or can I join 2 of them together in order to make one larger panel, which specifically usually is only done with panels that are next to each other, not panels atop each other. And again, I would say this is to keep the theatrical feel to this story, which is a more impersonal way of looking at the story, which allows you to engross yourself within this world, which is not something you would normally be familiar with. And again, you can see where he starts to play with it, going off of this initial pattern, which you're only going to get 6 panels on a page. Now, John Buscema can cram in 12 panels within this very specific way of putting down a page. It's very interesting the way that he would do that. He uses, I guess you'd call them floating heads in order to have some narration. But again, they're just usually a very thin panel, which is cut off from your main theatrical large panel. And by the way, I guess I should mention, of course, that the stories are based upon your old Robert E. Howard way of telling a story, which is at times heavy on narration and heavy on story development through people talking. So, believe it or not, you're looking at old Conan books, you're going to get a lot of A, narration, and B, word balloons. So again, you got to take that into consideration within putting your panel layout. This is why I think you're looking at, again, large panel, small panel, large panel within these 3 sections. It depends on, again, it doesn't have to be that exact pattern. You start to play with it. You can have a lot of different variations within different books. But again, one of the points which changes that is how much narration am I going to have to put in here? How many word balloons am I going to have to put in here? There's going to have to be much more space. And again, there's a lot of talking in Conan the Barbarian, whether you think there is or not. This is something which is a little bit different than mine because I actually tend to move at a breakneck speed instead of using political intrigue and things like that, at the very least for my first books, which is what you're going to get with CROM the Destroyer. So unlike that old Conan the Barbarian run where you get a lot of talking interspersed by some really good action, with my books you're getting a lot of action interspersed with some talking in order to have downtime between each of these very massive scenes which have a lot of things going on. Again, breakneck speed. I like action. So, in essence, whereas you have Robert E. Howard and his successors, or his imitators, depending on how you want to describe them, and Roy Thomas would be one of those, they're telling a story about a barbarian in barbaric times with very refined and very accurate language. And so it is with John Buscema and his panel layout. He's telling a story, visually, which has barbaric elements to it, whether it be violence or stimulation of one kind or another, but in giving you those scenes, those primal scenes, he's doing so with a very refined and well laid out panel order that allows the mind to focus on those barbaric things or those stimulating things without having to think too much about how the visual story is being conveyed to you. And I think this works on 2 levels. Number 1, as I said, it is appealing to more of a baser, barbaric part of your brain, while at the same time not engaging that part of your brain so that you flee away from the page. But at the same time, it's presenting you a world which is fantastical, and so it's giving you a very structured order within which it is presenting that fantastical world so you can concentrate on the world itself and figure it out, again, without having to figure out instinctually or back away instinctually with anything that has to do with the panel layout and the visual way it's being told. This works with a number of other things interplaying with it as well, including the lack of sound effects, also including a very refined and limited color palette where they use colors specifically, very specific colors on very specific panels. And I would also include the sparse background, whereas you get within these comics a lot of dust, you get a lot of sand, you get a lot of areas that don't need to be described or understood by a lot of visual detail. But all of those things deserve a video on their own. I'm concentrating on the panels. And so, again, why am I going over all of this? Well, really, there's no real reason why I'm going to do videos like this, except to be a little bit more positive in the fact that I want to talk about the creation of how you actually make something well, if you ask me. I'm following patterns which are set up by people who know exactly what they're doing and who are appealing to the human mind, to the human instinct, to the human eye, to the rational part that is actually going to lay down a pattern for you so that other people might get something out of them to help create. And I think that's what John Buscema was doing. He was laying down a pattern so that the human mind that was reading these stories, which, by the way, is focused on, again, there's a lot of dialogue, even though it's a story about a barbarian and is supposed to be sword and sorcery. At the same time, I would say that panel layout, that standard panel layout, which lent your mind to a theatrical looking at this story or a television way of looking at this story, it at the same time is providing you with a very standard way of looking at the page. So again, oddly enough, you're looking at these barbaric things happen in a very, very rational, standard way of appealing to the visual. And again, unless you're actually looking for these things, like I am, you probably won't see them, but your mind will pick up on them, and that's the point. That's the point of why most people would say, I don't like this. When I'm looking at a lot of fantasy novels, whether they be independent comics or the stuff that is coming out from the big two, or even the smaller indie comics that are comic companies, when they put out fantasy, they're not giving me a standard panel layout in order to follow the story in a much more rational way to balance out the barbaric and the fantastical that you're going to get. And I think that is needed so that the human mind is actually focusing more on the story. And again, the instinctual part of your brain isn't going, this is something I'm looking at that's horrific in a very jumbled up pattern, which is unfamiliar to me. Therefore, I don't like it. I'm backing away. Why? Caveman instinct tells me it's something that is actually violent and unfamiliar. Therefore, back away a little, back away a little. Within your standard panel format, it's saying, here's something comfortable. Here's a variation on something comfortable. I'm going to show you a barbaric scene within this comfortable way of looking at scenes in order to give you a pulled back look at this. So you're not going to, again, your mind is not going to instinctually say, what is that? I'm going to back away. This is very much the way that comics should be made. And I think that most people are missing this right now. And again, it's not stodgy. It's not locking yourself into something which is going to hamstring you. It's being creative according to the patterns within which the human mind finds things more appealing. And that's what we need to do. Again, if you want to push back against what is going on in the culture right now, create something new, but do so in a way that is actually going to be appealing to the human mind. Going back to that Perch video, yes, sales numbers do actually reflect whether or not people like these things, but whether or not they like them, if you're actually concentrating on things like merit, if you're someone who has that mindset of I'm going to look for something good rather than I'm going to push an ideology which really has no rational basis, which is what modern comics, standard current comics are doing right now, you're going to look for something that instinctually appeals to you, to the human mind, to the human instinct, to the human passions, and the human reason all at the same time, and you can do so and still be creative. All right, I rambled on this topic way too long. I thought this was going to be a short video that I was going to put out. So perhaps if you've made it this far into the video, let me know. First of all, did you like this kind of video? Secondly, would you rather it be much shorter, or would you rather I just ramble on about these things and pull in all of these smaller bits here and there, talking about Roy Thomas and how he didn't want to put in things like sound effects? Or should I leave that to an entire separate video and just do short video after short video about sound effects, about panel development, about the way the human eye actually sees these things? What would you rather? And again, as usual, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe. And don't forget, the links are in the description for my graphic novels, which you have been looking at in part in the background for this video. Thomas Valiant and the Valiant Heroes, 2 books which are now available for order. Link in the description for the Indiegogo page for that. And CROM the Destroyer, my upcoming fantasy graphic novel, which is a love letter to those old Conan the Barbarian stories and comics to some extent, which you can go to the early bird sign up page, link in the description for that as well. If you sign up there, you will be informed via email when the project goes live and get a free exclusive pinup poster with your order. Oh, by the way, the 2 trailers for CROM the Destroyer are also linked in the description and at the end of this video. They are, I think, 45 seconds and a minute and a half, respectively, and you've been looking at some of that in the background. If you're wondering what that moving screen is when I put those up, those are my trailers, but they're not just visual. I have voiceovers. I have actual voice actors doing a little bit of giving you a hint of the story, so you might want to click on those if you want to see more about what CROM the Destroyer is. Anyways, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.